And welcome to episode 135 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. I'm Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
And this is John Denning, giggling down in Los Angeles.
What are you giggling about?
I don't know. I heard you giggle as you started this thing, and it made me laugh.
I did the countdown to the intro backwards, and I'm like, what? What was my problem?
I heard a chuckle out of you, and it tickled me.
Yeah, I was laughing at myself. How are you doing today?
I'm pretty good, man. I'm pretty good. I'm having a flashback drinking memory, and due to you, largely. I'm just going to get right into it. I poured myself a glass of really good port that I've had since my Portuguese visits, and you were just over there, so that is what has inspired my drink today. So thank you.
Yes.
It's quite good. It's a Graham's Tawny Port, 20-year-old. It's delicious.
Yeah, you went up to the Porto area, and as you point out, I just came back from Portugal, which was super cool. Although I didn't go to the Douro Valley. I will go there next time, but I'm having a Vinho Verde, which is not a green wine, as the name suggests, but a white wine from it's kind of a region style right outside Lisbon. So very light, refreshing. It's really warm here. So it's nice to have something like that. But that was the inspiration was all about traveling, and I wanted something Portuguese, and I think you saw that and were like, yeah, I was just there. I'll do it.
Yeah.
Good call.
That's exactly what caught my eye. And we're talking about international LSATs today, too. So there is some kind of thematic thread, I suppose, that runs.
That is exactly the case. And I suppose, international music as well, although the UK really isn't international. But I've been reading the classic book, Hammer of the Gods, about Led Zeppelin. I'd never have read it. I've always wanted to read it. It's different than what I expected, but that inspired the music choice, which is Led Zeppelin. One of my all-time favorite bands. And I'd asked you, I was like, what's your favorite song by them? And you actually ended up picking the song through that route.
Inadvertently, yeah. Yeah, my just knee-jerk answer when you asked me that question, because obviously their catalog is deep and storied, I said How Many More Times, which is not one of their best-known songs, but it's one that I really love. And it does. You picked it for the episode today. I think it fits pretty well, because we're going to talk a lot about taking the less well-known tests, taking makeup exams, taking tests overseas and international, and how that all works. So an international band talking about essentially what is a countdown sort of thing here. How many more times? It fits. I like it.
It does fit. And that is a great song off the end of Led Zeppelin 1. Mm-hmm. If you haven't really gotten into their catalog, it rocks hard.
Greatest band of all time, for my money. Greatest band of all time.
I don't know that I would say they're the greatest of all time. I love Jimmy Page. I do think he's an insanely great guitarist, but I will say that this is one of those songs that if you want to get hyped up a little bit, listen to it, because it struts through the song. It makes you feel very strong and powerful.
It's a good way to put it. Yeah, it's kind of a pump-up song before a test, before the gym or something.
Absolutely, and then listen to that ringing guitar that he rolls over the top of it. It's just Anyway, you can talk about Led Zeppelin all day long. Let's talk about the LSAT world instead.
Womp womp, but all right.
Yeah, it's all right. Let's talk about some things that are coming up here. The registration for the August test just closed. So really the next thing on the calendar from a testing standpoint is the August LSAT on the 11th and 12th of August. The September registration for the September test is coming up here. It'll close on July 25th. And then that September test is really the first week of September. It's on the 8th and the 9th. So right now, if you're registered for the August test, you're set to go. If you need to take an LSAT that's coming up, September is your option. August is closed. And as always, if you're preparing for either of those tests or one of the future ones, we've got a continuous series of webinars that we post for free access. There's one on the 19th of July about circular games in logic games, and anybody who attended the recent Crystal Ball knows that I've mentioned the presence of some circular games floating around on prior unreleased tests. We've got an LSAT 101 webinar on the 2nd of August, and then basic and advanced conditional reasoning webinars on the 16th of August and the 29th of August. So if you want to register for those, you can go to powerscore.com/free seminars. and they are there. And John, I know you have an update about the crystal ball that we just did.
I do, in fact, although I'm going to give one intermediate update about that Circular Games webinar that you just mentioned. Not only are there some non-disclosed circular games from recent tests that we've seen in the last couple of years that are likely to reappear, but speaking of makeup exams, there was a circular game on the June makeup test, sort of rather infamously a reuse of the February 2014 LSAT for the makeup folks last week. So that is not only a relevant topic, but certainly one that people need to bone up on for both August and September, I think. So make the webinar on the 19th of this month of July for Circular Games. Make that a priority if you're listening to this.
Nice. And as far as the crystal ball, we've just finished that a week ago.
That's right.
One of the biggest ever. A huge amount. It was also probably the longest crystal ball ever. It went a solid 2 hours, which is well beyond the normal limit. But I think we both had things that we wanted to say about the sections that we covered. Yeah. And then how have we handled that for the public access now?
Well, public access is really the driving key here, because we have made, unlike some other crystal balls that we've done in the past, we've made this one available for free to everyone. Whether you were able to attend live, whether you're a PowerScore student, whether you were enrolled or not, you can get access to the recording of that crystal ball webinar, the video, the 2 hours or so. Largely my fault that Dave mentioned. I feel the fingers pointing at me, Dave. And I earned it. I deserve it.
You did the majority of talking.
I did. I was feeling chatty. What can I say? But there's a lot of good content in that. So if you're interested in checking out that crystal ball for both of these upcoming tests, you can go to our website, powerscore.com/LSAT, enter your information there, and we will email you a link with information on how to access that recording. And the great news for our students is if you are a current PowerScore student taking a course, doing tutoring, even if you're just subscribed to the testing and the analytics package that we offer that is awesome and very affordable, you have access not only to that video, but also to the curated problem sets, the bespoke content that we put together before each of these crystal balls that we think is most reflective and most representative of what's coming up on these future tests. So we have essentially, when I say curated, we have built these problem sets out for our students. So you just go in and you literally click on a link and it opens the problem sets and launches it. It's super easy, super convenient. And as we have seen in the last couple of tests, super useful. So again, please take advantage of those recommended problem sets. That to me is really the highlight of those sessions, I think.
Indeed. And if you don't recall parts of it, or if you haven't seen it before, you get access to that link. You can review it as many times as needed. You can hear our discussion of the various problem type frequencies, type of LSAT, LR questions that occur most frequently, the logic games that occur most frequently, and so on. So it covers a lot of different ground, huge study help just in and of itself, and then very specifically focused on August and September here with what is most likely to be recreated in terms of its concept. So definitely worth checking out, and we've heard that from hundreds, if not thousands, of people now.
Yeah, I was going to say we had hundreds of people in the session back when we did it. I forget, when did we do it? The 29th of June?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, that feels right. But we had hundreds of people in that room who had taken Crystal Ball, or attended Crystal Ball webinars with us before and had just taken the June test. Some had even taken the April test. And the feedback from them in terms of just the utility of what we had said in prior Crystal Balls was extremely gratifying. We make no secret about how successful we've been in terms of our accuracy. We're certainly not shy. But it was really gratifying to hear hundreds and hundreds of people be like, look, I'm still taking the test again, but you guys were spot on and it helped me. Or if I hadn't done this game, I wouldn't know how to do the fourth game that I actually saw on test day. That kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's validating.
So again, we can keep beating this drum. It feels pretty well worn. But it's, not only validating for us, but the fact that we're still on the right track with these after several years of doing it is remarkable and something that people should absolutely take advantage of.
Yep, because we can't guarantee that we'll do it for every test. As soon as we don't think it's useful or that they become less predictable, we'll stop doing it.
Yeah, I can guarantee that we won't, in fact. I can guarantee that there is a shelf life to this.
There's a point in time where we will stop doing it. I think we both know that, and we're honest about that. That's one of the reasons that we're able to do it now, is because we know that what we're doing has a high degree of chance of being correct. So in any event, another thing that really kind of I think almost rocks not so much the LSAT world, but the admissions world last week was the presence of some Supreme Court decisions. Mm-hmm. Court weeks these days are always full of interesting information. And there were really two cases that I think impacted people who are applying to law school this upcoming cycle, even those who went to law school in the past who have law school debt. And I'm going to talk about both these cases very briefly. I'm not going into the details of them. We've talked a little bit before about some of the aspects of the Harvard / UNC case. And I think other kind of commentators have made really good insights about this. But I wanted to comment just a little bit about the Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard, the SFFA. And this was a decision that could have really changed the way people apply to law school significantly, especially those, who are minority or underrepresented candidates. But one of the things I noticed in reading through that decision was that it was much narrower than expected. Mm-hmm. But the way it got reported in the mainstream media was as if, affirmative action and the use of race or any racial considerations in applications have been completely demolished. That's not the way that decision reads at all. In fact, it specifically contemplates cases and scenarios where that can be used. And so this really felt to me like a classic example of, the media picking it up, writing a story in 30 minutes and missing all the nuance to it. It really gave schools a lot of latitude in terms of how they want to treat race as part of a set of admissions criteria. And I think it will require some changes, but I think a lot of commentators really, especially inside the process, expected sweeping, widespread changes that would completely change the system as it is. That's not what happened. So if you want to learn more about that, go read the decision. If you want to go to law school, read these decisions. I find it fascinating to read them and the history, and you can see especially a lot of people commentating about how the judgment was handed down, and a lot of people surprised that it was as narrow as it was. And then you go read the New York Times or something, and they're like, that's the end of affirmative action. It's like, that's not what that said at all. And we had that debate here internally and discussed that. And obviously we work with a lot of lawyers here. So I think the media didn't really understand it. They wanted to reduce it to a couple sentences that just missed all the nuance to it. So it may be a step backward overall, but it wasn't, a drop off the cliff. And who knows what will happen. There's now more lawsuits that'll get fired out from all this. The other was the student loan or student debt relief case, where the idea of kind of like taking $10,000 off of everybody's debt had been floated, and that was struck down as well. But I don't think that's a debt issue either. There's actually another act that they can go ahead and use, and the president immediately said that is what he was planning on doing. So I think maybe the one pathway they tried didn't work, but you can climb Everest through different routes. Now they'll just do a different route. And by a lot of perspectives, the first route that they tried was one of the weaker routes. So it may very well be that the strongest pathways are still yet to be tested. So you can't guarantee that they're going to freeze that debt or eliminate parts of it, but I don't think that issue is over and done with yet. So that's something, if you're going to law school and you're about to take on some debt, you really want to keep an eye on. And that's that.
And there you go. I think that's a fair take on both of those recent developments. So I have nothing to add. Also helps that you know more about that stuff than I do, so I'll just shut up.
I'm forced to pay attention to it sometimes. And
yeah.
I've
paid oblique attention. I've kind of existed on the periphery of this stuff, voyeuristically.
I've become friends with a lot of admissions professionals, both in law schools and outside of law schools. And this is exactly the kind of decision that comes down that they all want to talk about.
Yeah.
And then they start thinking about, how does this affect all the different groups? Does it change the way students think about applying to law school? Does it change who applies to law school? So they want to really kind of examine all the facets of it. And obviously those are interesting conversations. They're not really LSAT conversations, but they certainly are more than tangentially related to people applying to law school and taking the LSAT. So I'm happy to engage in that and learn honestly from talking to some of the people who really know more than I do about it.
Yeah, it's nice to hear that you've got a more positive take than some of what is out there. Obviously, it's not great news what we're seeing here, but it doesn't seem to be quite as devastating as it could be.
That was the first reaction that I heard was, this isn't as bad as we thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
And usually that's a good thing. I think a lot of professionals immediately started saying, well, they are allowing us to have these considerations, but the way in which we obtain that information and how we consider it has to be different. Is that workable within our framework? Yes, it is. So there was some degree of, I'm not going to say relief, but more comfort than perhaps I expect. I think a lot of people were prepared for a scenario in which it was completely outlawed, not even something they could look for or ask for, or even make a determination on, and they felt that that would be challenging, and I'm sure that it would be. So either way, let's talk a little bit about these international and makeup LSATs, because the whole topic, as you mentioned before, is we really want to talk about two things: who can take these tests, both makeup and international tests, and then a question that I know both of us get with a high degree of frequency: are these tests harder than the regular LSAT administrations? So a lot of times people think, well, I'm not a makeup or an international test taker. And my response to that is, you never know when you're going to be a makeup LSAT taker.
Yeah.
You can't predict it. So anybody is conceivably inside that kind of like knowledge zone. And so it's something just to kind of almost like reassure yourself with. But let's start off. We're going to talk about two main things: who can take these tests and whether they're different. So let's start with that first one: who can take these tests? And let's start with the international test, John. And it's funny because a lot of times when people look at this, they're like, well, there's a US, kind of / Canada test, and there's an international test. And the first thought that they have is it's about, your citizenship status.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're an American or a Canadian, you take the domestic test. And if you live in any other country, you're an international test taker. But that is not what it actually is. They use a different criteria as opposed to citizenship.
Yeah. For these tests, they use physical location at the time of testing. So if you are not in the country where you register to take this test, when you are meant to take it, you cannot take it. And I think that's probably the key to who can take the international test is, as long as you are in the place where the international test is being offered, you can take it there, but you can't essentially like transfer this overseas. You can't take the domestic test from Europe, and you can't take a European test here domestically.
Yeah, and that sounds almost confusing, but that rule is, where are you at the time you take the test? If you're in the US, you will be taking the domestic US-Canada test. If you're outside the US, no matter where you're a citizen of, you will be taking the international test, assuming it's been offered. A lot of times people get confused by that, or they forget. They're like, oh, I registered 4 months ago for this test, but I've decided that I want to go to Europe for a week, but I'll take the LSAT. You better make sure they have an international test and get registered for that. So, if you're an American and you are studying abroad, a lot of times people are like, well, I'm an American. I should be able to take the regular U.S. test. There's no international test, so I take the U.S. because I'm a U.S. citizen. It's like, no, you can't. That is not how it works. You become an international test taker as soon as you leave the U.S. or Canada.
Right.
And, kind of conversely, if you're an international student, let's say you're from Korea and you're living in the U.S., you're on some kind of study abroad type of program, sometimes they're like, well, do I have to take the international test? No, you actually have to take the U.S. Canadian domestic test at that point, and they will confirm your location. Like if they can see that you live in Seoul, Korea as your permanent address, when they see that you are in fact in the US, they'll confirm that you are in fact going to be in the US for that test. And I think a lot of times people say, well, who cares? The test is given digitally or in person. Who cares which one I have? This is a test security issue.
Yeah.
They're worried about time zones and people taking the same test. If you're taking the test much earlier than other people, you could conceivably give information out that would bias other test takers. If you're taking the test much later, like if someone's on the West Coast and they take the test and then someone's in Paris, they're 8 hours ahead, you could have a sharing of information there that could be a problem. They don't want that to be the case. And that's why they continue to have these rules. So it's about where you are physically. Now, you know what the next question we always get, John.
Yeah. Can I cheat the system? Are there ways around this? Can I hide? This is the question I probably get asked the most about for international testing, because international tests aren't offered as often as the domestic tests are. So when you look at a series of like LSAT dates and there's 8 or 9 a year, not all of those are going to give international people an option to take a test at that point. So a lot of international people are looking to take domestic tests despite being overseas. That is explicitly prohibited by LSAC. So the next question becomes, somewhat nefariously, are there ways to fool the system? Can I do a VPN or some IP masker? Can I convince them that I'm in, Idaho when I'm actually in Fiji? I was trying to think of the two most disparate places.
Yeah, those are good examples.
Yeah.
And that
It's hard to feel
honestly
sorry for that person, by the way.
No, well, if they were in Fiji, I'm like, take the international test and just stop complaining.
Yeah, wait it out, Fiji.
It is the number one question that we get is there a way around it? And what I have discovered, certainly through watching people try it, certainly through talking to LSAC, is no, there really isn't. People who are thinking of VPNs going to work, no, they are actually checking for those things. They are looking to see if you are in country or not, depending upon which test you're actually taking. They're very careful about that. They do take this very seriously. And interestingly enough, I reached out to the head of test security over at LSAC and said, hey, we're going to talk about this. Is there anything that you can share about it? We know, that you check for VPNs and hotspots and IP masking and all the different, kind of low-level tricks that somebody might use to get around this. And the response that we got was an interesting one, kind of confirmed, oh, we're totally checking, certainly using those tools and others. We're looking at all sorts of things. But one of the points they made was that, people very infrequently talk about the repercussions of being caught trying to cheat the system. I think, in most cases, what they do is they'll just cancel your test or your registration or stop you from even getting into the testing room to actually do that. So you've wasted time, you've wasted money. But I know, and they've confirmed that in more severe cases, they'll pursue misconduct findings. Mm-hmm. Like, you misrepresented. I think that's when people really try to double down, like, no, I swear I was in Idaho. And they're like, sir, you're on a beach in Fiji. They'll pursue you for a misconduct finding, and they have never lost a case, apparently, that they've pursued in that fashion.
Yeah.
So the point that he made to me is like, look, we understand, and you'd expect me to say this, but I think we have the proof in hand that it's really not worth it to try to cheat the system. The downside is huge, and we are looking. So I think that probably should at least convince a lot of people that it's not worth the time and effort to try and go around it. Maybe you have to take a later LSAT, especially for international test takers. And some people might think, well, why don't they just give the LSAT internationally every single time? Because it's a lot of work. It's more test exposure. And those international tests are usually like 1,000 to 2,000 people maximum. If they did it every test, they'd probably drop to like 500 to 800. And they're thinking that's a lot of work for 500 to 800 people. Yeah. Why not do it every other test or so and have slightly bigger testing groups? I know that's kind of the way they think about this. So,
yeah, that's my understanding of it too, is the administrative hassle for 600 people is really not worth it. So that's why they try to, again, stagger these out a little bit. But yeah, don't try to play games with the system, guys. Don't try to fool LSAC or sneak one by them. If you get caught, your best case is they cancel it. Your worst case is they actually pursue you, and then you have a hard time with law school as an ambition in the first place.
Yeah, and in some cases, I've seen this drive extreme behavior. I've seen people fly in from the, out of the country into the U.S. to take a test, and that's completely legal and 100% acceptable as far as LSAC is concerned. If you are living in Tokyo and you decide that you want to come to Los Angeles to go ahead and take the LSAT on a regular domestic test, and you register for it as taking it in Los Angeles, and you show up in Los Angeles and take it, that's fine. It's about your physical location, not your citizenship or, general domicile. Let's switch to the other test we were going to talk about, John. Who can take the makeup test?
Yeah, I love this guy. My favorite. This has been, ever since they moved the test really digitally to at-home testing, they have always offered, for those unfamiliar with what we're talking about with the makeup, they have always offered a second test administration, essentially like a week and a half later, for anyone who had technical difficulties, who was unable to complete the test. Maybe the proctor screwed something up or just didn't know how things worked and they messed your timer up. Basically, anyone who struggled with some sort of logistical issue during their original exam qualifies potentially to take a makeup test about, a week and a half, 10 days or so later. So that's always sitting there as something of a safety net. Most people don't realize it. You have to submit a complaint and apply for this and then get approved. They'll often go back and actually check the tape of your original testing, see what it was that happened. But again, it's another one of those slightly obscure, slightly misunderstood, or at least little understood tests that accompany the main administration, kind of like international tests do. So those are the people who can qualify for a makeup test. Anyone who was unable to complete the original exam as intended due to some issue that is not their own fault or their own making. So if you get in there and you pull your cell phone out in the middle of section 2 and they cancel your test, that's on you. If you get in there and your power goes out in the middle of section 2 or your proctor disappears and kicks you out, that's on them. Or at least that would theoretically qualify you for them to give you another chance.
Yeah, and certainly we've tied the makeup test and the international tests here together because of the difficulty question, but also because it's a question of access. Some people are unsure who can take the domestic or international test, and a lot of people are uncertain of who can take the makeup test.
Right.
And the key thing here is you're not automatically given it. Especially if you cause the problem, they're typically not going to give it to you. What they are instead doing is looking at what happened and trying to determine if this was especially some kind of issue on their part and then how significant it was. If you lose access to the test for 15 seconds, they're not going to give you the makeup test. But you lose access for 8.5 minutes, something like that, or a whole section, that's when you start to see them saying, all right, your test experience has been the integrity of it has been undermined to the extent that we need to go ahead and give you that makeup. So the access there is you got to ask for it. You've had to have had a significant problem. You do not get the same LSAT. You get a new, different LSAT, assuming you saw any part of the original test, and usually they're always giving a new one anyway.
Yeah.
So just something to be aware of. And I can't really think if there's a whole lot more to say about that makeup test. It's usually
I've got
like
one
a
more
week and a
thing
half.
to say. Yeah.
Okay.
I've got one additional point to make here, which is that they often will offer this very grudgingly, which is to say the first response that you often get from LSAC when you submit a complaint or you talk to someone there about the makeup is they say no. And they'll try to push you to take the next scheduled administrative test as opposed to the makeup the next week where you get your score along with everyone else. And it essentially keeps you on the same timeline. And so what it takes at that point typically is some persistence, polite persistence. You may have to appeal to LSAC a couple of times, maybe even try to escalate this to a manager or some sort of department head over there. But if you qualify, you will get it. It just may take a little more work on your end, asking more than once before it's finally granted. So just, again, be polite, be persistent, be patient. You will qualify if you deserve it.
Yeah. And usually what they're trying to do is give you a range of options. If you took the LSAT on a Saturday, it may not be convenient for you to take a makeup test 10 days later. So usually what they say is you can always take the next test, which I think is totally fair. But for some people, they're like, no, especially we've gone through a period of time here where time was of the essence in terms of applications. So for a lot of people, it's like, I can't wait, or I'm not going to be around in a month or two. So just something to be aware of. You'll have options typically, but if you don't qualify, it can be very difficult to get them to move in terms of offering it to you. Just asking isn't going to do it. Not to say that we're advising that you hector them or bother them in any particular way. What we're saying is it may not be that the disruption is in their eyes significant enough. And if they make that adjudication, you're out of luck. Yeah. You're going to have to just move to the next LSAT. So just be aware of how the process works. It's not based upon your request. It's based on their decision.
Well, there we go. I think that at least clarifies who qualifies to take these two types of tests, international and the makeups. So the second question that we get just about as often as can I take this thing or how does it work is, am I going to notice a difference in terms of the content? Is this going to be a harder test? Are they going to punish me for having to schedule me for a makeup or because my internet was glitchy or their proctor was? What do I expect, basically, if I see an international exam or a makeup test relative to the original exam that was offered domestically? So let's dive in. Yeah.
That's the biggest fear right there is that, oh my God, I didn't get the regular test. And now because it's somehow a different test, I'm going to get a harder test.
Right.
The good news is they are not harder. They're not inherently more difficult. The scales aren't inherently tighter. They're not designed to be more challenging or more problematic. And in fact, the really good news here is that they use the same pool of LSATs for all these tests. So the LSATs that can be chosen for a regular domestic test are also used for international LSATs on occasion. They're also used for makeup LSATs on occasion. So what you're really seeing is they're not different to us. As when students ask me this, John, I always say the same thing. I was like, don't worry about it. It's just another LSAT.
Yeah.
And what I mean is that at any given time, LSAC has a pool of possible tests that they could administer. Anybody who's been to a crystal ball knows that we talk about this a lot, and we're always saying, which are the most likely tests to be used or pulled out? This is kind of like we've made a lot of mileage out of these predictions in the last couple of years in terms of understanding what they're doing. We feel like we have a really good, understanding. But sometimes what I'll notice is they take LSATs that we thought were in the pool for the domestic test, and they'll administer them on the international side, or they'll administer it as a makeup, which doesn't often change what we think because those groups are so much smaller. Usually a maximum of a few hundred makeup testers, maybe 1,500 to 2,000 max international test takers, and usually like 1,000. So they're not very big groups that are floating around. But LSAC doesn't see them as different. Students see them as different tests. They just see it as another LSAT administration. This one with the label international, this one with the label makeup. It's the same in the past. They used to have Sabbath day tests. Those were just regular LSATs too. And when those Sabbath LSATs existed, I'd always get the same question. Is this going to be a harder test? I was like, nope, just another LSAT. And John, to kind of prove this point, you and I went into the archives and took a look at not the most recent, but a relatively recent LSAT that was unreleased and looked at some of the usages of this test to kind of prove the point that a regular LSAT that is given to domestic U.S. Canadian test takers is also given to all test taking groups. So I can go through this or you can go through this. You tell me.
You talking about February 2016?
I am.
I'm happy to go through it. You and I probably both will enjoy going through it, honestly, because it speaks to this point so clearly, how these older non-disclosed tests really do get around. In fact, I made reference to February 2014 as the test used for the most recent makeup in June. I think the international test in June was from January 2019, if memory serves. So, yeah, we're seeing lots and lots of reusages of tests that were given previously, which again just speaks to the fact of like these are not new exams, they're not different exams, they're not harder. In fact, if anything, they're kind of well worn. We've seen these tests around a lot. And to prove it, let me go through a very quick history of the February 2016 LSAT. So this has been a little over 7 years ago when they first administered this domestically. It's a non-disclosed test, as all those old February tests are. And here are some of the usages that we have seen post-original. It was used twice internationally. One was in February of 2018 in Asia and Australia, and another was in June of 2018 in Europe. So just that year alone saw this test reused twice, both overseas in 2 different places. It actually made a bigger appearance in October of 2020 as one of the LSAT Flex domestic tests, so a regular exam. So a little over 4.5 years later, they brushed that test off and used it again here, home side, as it were. It came up again internationally in January of 2021. It was one of the international flex tests there. In October of that same year, October 2021, it was the makeup LSAT. So anyone in that October test who struggled or had an issue, this was the makeup that they received, February 2016. It was the paper and pencil test the next month, November 2021. And then finally we saw it again for the makeup test a year later, October of 2022. It was the makeup exam there as well. And will continue to be used into the future. We're saying this past tense, but it's going to come up again. This test, February 2016, is not done. Until they release it, it's going to get used again.
So I find that really interesting, and I want to kind of like recap parts of that I think really kind of like capture the real point. So this test was given in February of 2016. February LSATs during that era were not released. So it was a non-disclosed test. So they gave it to a bunch of people. They got their scores back, but they never saw the questions. At that point, LSAC can take that test and put it back on the shelf of the library of options. Now, they're not going to administer it immediately. They'll give it a year to cool off, so to speak, and for those test takers who saw it in February of 2016 to get out of the system largely and to get through into the next cycle. But if you were going to take that international test in 2018 and you asked me, is this going to be a harder test? Afterwards, I would have told you, see, it wasn't a harder test. It was a regular LSAT. This was administered in the US and Canada in February of 2016, and now you're seeing it in Asia and Australia in early 2018. And as they often did at that time, they flipped it to the other international side, to the European international side for the following exam there. But that's an example of an international test that's being administered that is just another regular domestic test. You had a couple of others. They reused it as a regular test. They reused it as a paper and pencil test. They used it as a makeup twice in the last few years. And that's what we mean when we say these international makeup tests and paper and pencil tests for that matter, they are just regular LSATs. In each case, this was originally administered to a substantial population in February 2016 domestically. And then it just sits there and gets re-administered. They just pull it off. It's like a record that you really like to play. And not that most people are playing records these days, but you pull the record off the shelf and you play it, you dust it off, and then a couple months later you pull it off and play it again. And that's exactly what they're doing here. So the concern that someone might have, which I think is a legitimate concern initially, that this might be a harder test because it's a smaller, different group. It is not. It is just another LSAT. And this is one of many examples we could cite, John. Mm-hmm. And this isn't even the full record of this test. This is a partial record that we're just using to kind of like show the variety of ways that they use these LSATs in. And they just consider them interchangeable. Once an LSAT goes into the books and they're like, it's valid, it's reliable, they don't care who they give it to. They give it to people according to what the availability is and what people have seen before. They're all the same to them. They're not special LSATs. There's not like, this is my favorite LSAT to administer. Just another number in a big catalog that they're using as suits them.
Yep. So that's at least, 7 repeats of that original February 2016 domestic test. And like you say, that's not even a complete accounting, I don't think. I'm sure there have been a few more instances and will continue to be, as I said. And interestingly, Dave, and I think you kind of allude to this isn't even their favorite test to reuse. We've seen this one reappear 7 times since its original administration, but there are other older February tests that they have used 10 plus times since the original. So this is very standard practice, very common, nothing on our end at least that's surprising about this. But the takeaway, of course, is that if they're just continuing to reuse the same tests over and over for international and makeup people, they are not harder tests. They're the exact same LSATs that other people have already seen.
Yeah, this is standard operating procedure. And sometimes what people will say is, well, what if it is harder? And I always say the same thing. All right, then your scale will be looser. That's how the LSAT works. If a test is logically harder or logically more difficult, then they loosen the scale. If a test is logically easier or not quite as tough, then they tighten the scale. That's how the whole process of making standardized tests work. It's supposed to produce the same outcome. And that same outcome applies to domestic, international, makeup, paper and pencil, any LSAT that is actually given. So hopefully that definitively puts to rest with examples the whole concern, because I don't want people thinking it might be harder and having that affect their psyche, their mental outlook on this. I want people who are taking these tests to be able to say, it's just another LSAT. I need to prepare for this the way I would any other test. I don't need to have the special extra burden of thinking I got screwed over an extra step on top of everything else. That's not the case. That's not what's going on here.
Yeah, I think the fear here, deep-seated, is that there's something punitive about taking the test overseas or about being, the squeaky wheel and having to do the makeup test. They're going to penalize me because they don't want me to have to do this thing. I'm a hassle. And again, clearly not the case. For those of you who are maybe listening to this and are newish to the LSAT, and you just heard Dave talk about scaling and conversions and things, an easier scale or a tighter scale and a looser scale, there's a really good blog post that Dave wrote about what -7, -8, -9 means in the scaling. If you just Google PowerScore blog scale, you will find that article and you can read through it and you'll see exactly what he means by looseness versus tightness of scale, but you'll also just get a sense of how the conversion of this works from your raw score to a converted one. It's a really interesting article, and I think it'll give you some insights on how LSAC operates with with what you're actually doing, your performance.
All right. John, I got nothing more to say about these tests. What about you?
I don't think I do either. Yeah. The big takeaway here is make sure you're qualified for the test you intend to take. Plan accordingly. If that means you have to come to the States to take one earlier because it's not overseas, or if that means you need to make sure you're in the right place to take it. And know, too, that you're going to get an LSAT, same as every other one. Nothing harder, nothing easier. It's still luck of the draw. But there's certainly nothing especially difficult about the International and the Makeup test by design.
No, what you get is what you get. It's supposed to be the same as every other LSAT. There is luck of the draw, what I call the casino effect that floats around. I wrote a long blog about that. So there's always some people who will be advantaged or disadvantaged because they like the concepts or they're better at those concepts. But that is not because the LSAT itself is inherently different. That's just the way LSATs are constructed. So you can read that casino effect blog. If that comment sounds confusing or uncertain, it certainly explains some of the ways that the construction of the LSAT in general randomly benefits or harms people who are actually taking it. So on that note, John, if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or YouTube, or anywhere else you may actually find it. And if you enjoyed it, leave us a comment or rating as well. And if you have any questions, we'll certainly be doing a mailbag at some point relatively soon. Send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. On behalf of John and myself, hope you had a great week. Stay safe out there, and we'll talk to you soon.